So, Tom Baker.
1974 was a historic year for Doctor Who, with not only the departure of Jon Pertwee and the arrival of Tom Baker, but also the transition behind the scenes. Producer Barry Letts had overseen the majority of the Third Doctor era with its grounded, contemporary feel, and after introducing the new Doctor, Letts handed over to Philip Hinchcliffe, who immediately set about revamping the series with a more sci-fi and even adult tone. Hinchcliffe made his mission statement clear with his third serial, The Ark in Space. Robert Holmes' creepy space opera was an instant hit with audiences, achieving the show's highest viewing figures since 1965. Even 40 years later, showrunners Rusty Davies and Stephen Moffat have both cited this story as their favourite of the classic series. There's something primally perfect about it. You could have handed it to any cast throughout the history of Doctor Who and they could do it. It's the perfect script, as I'm sure they thought when they made Alien.
Wait, what?
In 1979, Alien was released in theatres. Directed by Ridley Scott, it's been described as a haunted house story in space with its grungy atmosphere and haunting design work from H.R. Giger. It was a monster hit, making both Scott and star Sigourney Weaver household names, spawning a whole franchise, and becoming one of the most influential films of its genre.
And as Moffat joked, the film does bear some resemblance to The Ark in Space, broadcast only 4 years earlier.
Parasitic creature on a spaceship infects a crew member and starts picking the others off one by one. It's practically a running joke among fans that Alien is just a big budget remake of this episode.
And does The Ark in Space remind you of anything? The story of a group trapped on a spaceship being consumed by an alien organism is similar to the original Alien movie.
In fact, when researching this video, I found the blog Adventures with the Wife in Space by Neil Perryman, where he and his wife Sue watch every episode of the classic series together. When reviewing this story, Sue speculated that Ridley Scott showed it to his crew and said, "I want it to look like that, but with decent lighting, sets, monsters and music." Or take that, Robert!
But is it really possible that the makers of this sci-fi classic were thinking of a low-budget TV serial? Well, today I attempt to answer the question, did Doctor Who rip off? No. Wrong way round.
Alien. Awoken from cryosleep, the crew of the Nostromo pick up a distress signal from a derelict vessel on an alien moon. Following an attack on their crewmate Kane, they soon learn to their horror that he's been impregnated by a seemingly unkillable organism which violently bursts from his chest and proceeds to stalk the remaining crew as its prey. After it's made clear the truckers are expendable to their company, the last survivor, Ripley, manages to escape the doomed ship and blast the creature into the void of space. The Ark in Space. The Doctor, Sarah Jane and Harry materialise on Space Station Nerva, orbiting Earth in the far future. On board, they discover the remnants of humanity in suspended animation and a dead insect-like organism which has already given birth to parasitic larvae. Leader of the crew, Noah, is infected and begins to metamorphise into the monstrous Wirren. Working with the remaining crew, the Doctor and their companions must stop the Wirren from spreading and consuming the rest of humanity in the hopes of taking over the empty Earth below.
As you can probably tell by that summary, there are quite a few similarities, but I'll give my thoughts on both first before I start comparing.
For me, The Ark in Space is like an encapsulation of classic Doctor Who. If someone who'd never seen an episode from this period wanted to know what they were like, I'd show them this. Think about it, huge movie-scale concepts on a humble TV budget. Isn't that just classic Who in a nutshell? And I don't mean that as a criticism, it's part of its charm, seeing how the production team brings these worlds and creatures to life with so little. Speaking of other worlds, one of Ark's strongest elements is Roger Murray Leach's production design, specifically the design of Space Station Nerva with its expansive clinical aesthetic, which still holds up well. They apparently used a mirror in the cryo room to make it look bigger, and it really works. The only thing letting the sets down for me are the stars outside the windows, which are clearly just fairy lights, but the script and performances are so strong that the setting remains believable. It's only a second story and Tom Baker is already great as the Doctor. It's no surprise he became so synonymous with the role, he's just effortlessly unpredictable and captivating in every scene. His scenes with Ian Marter's Harry in part 1 are probably the highlight for me, as this bumbling medical officer slowly earns the Doctor's respect.
You're improving, Harry.
Am I really?
Yes, your mind is beginning to work. It's entirely due to my influence, of course, you mustn't take any credit.
Liz Sladen joked in the DVD commentary that she doesn't get a lot to do here, but even so, Sarah Jane has some lovely moments with the Doctor and works well as a more grounded, warm character in this very sterile environment. The Wirren, as flimsy as they look in these overlit corridors, are actually quite an interesting monster. The larvae are pretty skin-crawling, and I like how they can actually communicate with the cast and aren't just mindless insectoids. As a kid, I always found the monsters that could turn you into one of them scariest, and the Wirren are a great take on this trope. The actual transformation itself is pretty eerie, but probably would be more effective if bubble wrap was still as novel as it apparently was back then. Robert Holmes' script is full of great dialogue and ideas that really sell these characters and the setting. Like most classic Who, it needs to be watched in the right environment to really feel the creepy atmosphere it's going for. But for Philip Hinchcliffe's first producing credit and the first adventure for this TARDIS team, it's an entertaining and confident debut. Alien is a film I first saw on TV with an introduction by Ridley Scott himself, and in many ways a lot of my enjoyment of the film comes from the real life stories of how it came to be. For what could have been a forgettable B-movie in the wrong hands, the script and performances take the material seriously and it feels completely immersive and real. The dialogue is naturalistic and the characters are believable, with Ian Holmes' Ash being my favourite. He's just fascinating to watch when you know the twist, and that little smile he gives when he wishes the crew luck towards the end is pretty unnerving. Obviously, the alien itself is a great creation. The biomechanical, raptor-like design is something I've always loved, and details like the acid blood and how it's mostly obscured by shadow make it all the more formidable. Essentially a horror story, it's a real slow burn, so like Ark, it's best experienced in the right setting, in the dark, with the sound turned up.
And now for the quickfire similarities between Alien and the Ark in Space.
Both are set on a spacecraft in the far future, although Ark is set significantly further down the line in terms of human history. A crew in suspended animation are awoken by outside interference. We open with an exterior shot from space and then cut to interior shots of the ship. The main characters explore an old and seemingly abandoned space vessel. The characters find an alien corpse in the first act. The main antagonist is a creature which lays eggs inside a human host. A crew member becomes infected by said creature. Both species have an alien queen, but to be fair, in Alien's case this isn't established until the sequel. The crew of the spacecraft is slowly picked off with only one survivor, although Vyra does have the rest of humanity waiting for her in literally the next room, so I guess she wins. Sorry, Ripley. The Wirren are destroyed by being blown up on a shuttle. This is actually how Ripley intended to kill the alien, but the reverse. She tries escaping into the shuttle and leaving the alien on the ship. This doesn't quite work. The general idea in both stories is that the creature has to be killed before it can reach Earth. Bit of a random one, but both have scenes where a character crawls through an air vent.
Coincidence? I think not!
Tonally, they're very different pieces.
The Ark in Space is bright, clinical, but optimistic, while Alien is dark, grungy, and full of existential dread. Ark even has the classic Doctor Who problem of everything being overlit. It works for these bold white sets, but especially in the second half where the Wirren take control of the ship, it would have been more atmospheric to have the lights dimmed throughout more of the story. Alien is often compared to Jaws because, like Spielberg before him, Scott knew his monster was scarier the less you saw of it, and so it's mostly in shadow and only on screen for around 4 minutes. This less is more approach also helps to hide the seams when the effects don't hold up. The scenes when the Wirren cut the lights work well for this reason, but I kind of agree with Sue from the Wife in Space blog that they should have cut the power earlier.
Hey, that blog was a goldmine. I'll reference it as much as I want.
That said, the bold white sets and costumes of the Nerva beacon allow the more colourful TARDIS team to really pop on screen, highlighting them as travellers from another time and place. There's also a clear class difference between these stories. Being a BBC production in the early 70s, Ark is very middle class, very well spoken. The crew, especially Vyra, speak incredibly technically and seem to have evolved past modern language since they seem confused by some of Harry's slang.
Oh, that'll do the trick, eh?
Your colony speech has no meaning.
I mean, it'll bring her round. Reverse the process.
And this makes narrative sense, since they're thousands of years in the future, and the Doctor describes the crew as the chosen descendants of humanity, implying it's mainly people of privilege and authority. Producer Jen Handorf described Alien as the working class film of the franchise on the Evolution of Horror podcast, and you can absolutely see this in the dialogue.
Before I even saw the film, I was always told that one of the best things about it was how the characters didn't talk like sci-fi characters. They talked about how much they were being paid.
The crew of the Nostromo are essentially space truckers just doing a job, and it's Ash who's most interested by the alien.
A real testament to the difference in dialogue here is that the only character in Alien who talks like the crew of the space station Nerva is literally an android.
Even the settings reflect the status of the characters. The Nostromo is a dirty, rundown cargo ship in stark contrast to the squeaky clean quarters of the Nerva beacon. The Whaling Company act as the unseen antagonists of Alien when it's revealed Ash is a sleeper agent wanting to keep the creature alive to be weaponized by the company. The faceless corporate entity views the crew's lives as ultimately unimportant in comparison to this deadly organism. So when the crew destroy Ash and Ripley eventually kills the alien, the workers are essentially rebelling against the company who left them for dead.
Rise up, comrades!
Both stories are interesting to analyse in terms of gender. The Ark in Space presents a future where Earth is overseen by a female High Minister, which Harry finds pretty amusing. Vyra is also depicted as a strong figure of authority and is the only awoken member of the crew to survive to the end. But even then, Sarah and Vyra are the only two women seen, and like Liz Sladen reflected, she doesn't get a lot to do, especially in the first half. Sarah was written as an out and proud feminist, and while this is well-meaning on the part of the creative team at the time, the minute the sci-fi plot is underway, the story often just doesn't doesn't know what to do with her. I mean, she's possessed in 2 consecutive stories in her final season. Now obviously, Sarah Jane's a legend and has plenty of great stories and moments to her name, but her limited role in this story is probably more a reflection of the times. Alien manages to avoid this since the characters were all written and cast essentially gender blind, hence they're all referred to by their surnames. Ripley, for instance, was never conceived as a woman until it was decided it would be more interesting for the last survivor to be female. While this approach to casting partly came from a desire to be more commercial, so Fox were more likely to greenlight the script, it allowed the cast to be developed as characters first before having to worry about gender roles, arguably empowering its female lead even more. A difference between the Wirren and the lifeform I'm trying really hard not to call a xenomorph are the different types of fear they evoke. They both tap into our human fear of parasites and infection, but with the Wirren, there's the added horror of losing your humanity. For me, one of the creepiest scenes is when Libri is first awoken and he's terrified of Noah, apparently seeing a monstrous shape in place of his leader. The underlying fear of impending insanity and turning into something monstrous make the Wirren a really interesting threat, and this is strengthened by Kenton Moore's haunting performance. Ridley Scott's monster leans more into body horror and sexual imagery with its phallic design and bloody method of reproduction. There's been a lot of analysis of the sexual themes and imagery in Alien, and screenwriters Dan O'Bannon and Ronald Shusett have admitted that this was intentional. You can probably find all sorts of Freudian symbols in the film, from Giga's suggestive designs to the Nostromo's AI mainframe literally being called Mother. These kind of ideas aren't really present in Ark unless you really reach for them. The plot point of the company behind the ship wanting to weaponize the creature also isn't in the Ark in space. In fact, the cast actively want to stop it getting back to Earth.
Going into this, I thought I'd find more in common, but they're quite different once you get past the initial premise. So after all that, did Doctor Who inspire the original Alien film? Personally, I'm gonna have to say no, at least not consciously.
After working on John Carpenter's black comedy Dark Star, screenwriter Dan O'Bannon wanted to rework the film's basic premise into a horror movie with a more convincing monster. He soon worked out an opening 29 pages for a script entitled Memory. Becoming stuck on what the threat of the film would be, O'Bannon brought on Ronald Shusett, and over 3 months the 2 writers developed a whole story treatment and hit a eureka moment when Shusett conceived the chestburster scene.
And so I woke up in the middle of the night and I said, Dan, I have an idea. And he said, what? And I said, the monster screws one of the people. He says, what? What are you talking about? I said, he jumps in his face, plants a tube down him, inserts his seed in him, and later it comes bursting out of his stomach. And Dan goes, oh my God, it's the most amazing thing I've ever heard. Nobody's ever seen anything like that.
It seems to be this moment that made the project stand out to those who read the early drafts, and eventually it was handed to producers Walter Hill and David Giler for rewrites. A lot of what's on screen in the final film, including the Ash android reveal, came from these revisions, though Hill and Giler were uncredited, allegedly because O'Bannon felt they were trying to oust him as the film's original creator. Further additions were added by Ridley Scott throughout production and post.
I just boiled down about 4 years of development into a single paragraph, and even from that, you can see that Alien is the culmination of several different creative visions, and as a result, many inspirations.
The documentary Memory, The Origins of Alien specifically explores the various texts and legends that inspired Dan O'Bannon and the filmmakers, treating the production of the film like a myth in of itself. O'Bannon is quoted in the film as saying, "I didn't steal from anybody. I stole from everybody." H.P. Lovecraft, Egyptian mythology, even the pulp sci-fi comics he used to read in secret as a kid all influenced the script in various ways. But as you might have noticed, no sign of Doctor Who.
From what I can find, no one involved in the production of Alien has ever cited the Ark in space as a source of inspiration.
According to Broad DW Cast, a guide to the international transmission of the classic series, this story first aired in the United States in September 1978, 8 months before Alien's American release and long after Shusett and O'Bannon began the script. It's doubtful either of them nor Hill and Giler would have seen it unless they happened to be visiting the UK in 1975. Being such a big sci-fi horror geek, it's not impossible O'Bannon could have heard of the show, but I found no evidence he ever mentioned it.
Now, obviously not every British person is a fan of Doctor Who, but it would be true to say that every British person has at least heard of Doctor Who, especially in the 70s. Why do I bring this up?
Because what slightly complicates matters is that principal photography on Alien was actually based in the UK at Shepperton Studios. Remember, Ark in Space was one of the most popular stories of its time, peaking at 13 million viewers for part 2. It's likely that if you were working in film and TV in the UK at the time, you could have seen this story, so the mostly British crew of the film could have been inspired by Ark on a subconscious level.
But obviously, I can't prove that anyone who worked on Alien saw the Ark in Space 4 years earlier. Or can I?
Shooting on Alien lasted 14 weeks, concluding in October 1978, and since Fox had already slated the film for a May release, it ran straight into post-production. Ridley Scott recalls, "The Fox people were fully convinced they were going to run the film in theatres on May 25th, so whatever cost we had to get it out, there was no let up whatsoever. I had to go crashing straight from Shepperton to Bray Studios where the effects and miniatures would be shot. I was joined at Bray by the special effects supervisor Nick Alder, who came across with his floor effects unit from Shepperton."
Who's Nick Alder, I hear you ask? Well, let's look at his IMDb.
That's right, Alder was film cameraman on The Invisible Enemy, notably the first appearance of K9. So Alien does in fact have some Doctor Who in its DNA, and it could well have influenced the film's visuals. Invisible Enemy is however Alder's only Who credit, and his contributions to the film were made in post, so even if he had seen Ark in Space, it couldn't have had any narrative influence. Nevertheless, Nick Alder does distantly connect these two distinct works.
Given Doctor Who's popularity in the UK, it's entirely possible that the show could have had an unconscious influence on Alien. But to say that the film directly took its premise from the Ark in Space would be inaccurate. They really aren't as similar as some would suggest.
Looking at them both as franchises, there is some crossover. In fact, Ridley Scott himself was the original set designer assigned to the very first Dalek story, meaning he very nearly could have designed the show's most famous villains. He left the BBC to train as a director at Granada before production began, and apparently took one look at the design we actually got and said, "It looks like a dustbin." Since Ridley seems surprised Jodie Whittaker was the Doctor long after her announcement, I'm guessing he's not kept that up to date with the franchise.
Doctor Who, on the other hand, has had a ton of references to Alien over the years.
I love 1958. No one's seen Die Hard, or Alien, or Die Hard 2, or Aliens.
That bit in Alien where that thing bursts out of John Hurt?
And probably the strangest example, which I only learnt about while writing this, a chestburster literally appears in Mind Warp.
Yeah.
That's right, the alien canonically exists in the Doctor Who universe. Can you imagine if these guys popped up next series?
I mentioned that Stephen Moffat is among the people who believe the plot of The Ark in Space was stolen by the Alien films, so I guess Last Christmas is his revenge on Robert Holmes' behalf. The Dream Crabs deliberately evoke facehuggers, and we even get this exchange.
They're a bit like facehuggers, aren't they?
Facehuggers?
Oh, you know, Alien. The horror movie Alien.
There's a horror movie called Alien.
So both the show and the characters are aware of the films, but again, there is no definitive proof that Ark in particular inspired Alien in any capacity. I think the similarities could even be explained as just Holmes, O'Bannon and Shusett being inspired by similar works.
It, the Terror from Beyond Space, also shares a lot of ideas with Alien. Workers on a ship accidentally let on board an alien stowaway which proceeds to pick them off before eventually being kicked out of an air vent.
And whether they drew from other movies, they probably did, like everybody. They drew consciously or self-consciously from things like The Terror from Beyond Space, but they actually, the ingredient of this thing being incubated in a human being made the whole damn thing stand out.
Even Robert Holmes is somewhat notorious for drawing from and arguably even ripping off other texts. The Manchurian Candidate, Sherlock Holmes, Hammer Horror, Russell T Davies was very inspired by the structure of Buffy. Moffat's Christmas specials draw from Charles Dickens to C.S. Lewis, and Chris Chibnall's Stenza are pretty much the same idea as The Predator. There's an old writing theory that there are only really 7 basic plots and there's just an infinite number of variations on them, and I think there's a lot of truth to that.
Every story ever told was inspired by something, and with Doctor Who about to enter its 7th decade, obviously it will have inspired a lot of media in that time. Even if Ridley Scott was never even aware the Ark in Space existed, this will always be an interesting example of how two very different works, made years apart and for completely different audiences, can both equally succeed in what they're trying to do. See you next time.